I'm Fergus Murray, the chair of Maze, and I'm here talking to Sonny Hallett. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Fergus. Yeah, so I'm Sonny. I'm Amaze's mental health advisor, and I also work as a counsellor.
Can you talk a bit about your 2018 report with Amaze? Too complicated to treat autistic people seeking mental health support in Scotland.
Yeah, so it's amazing to think that was 5 years ago now, and some of you might remember that I would have spoken about this at a CPG around that time. The Too Complicated to Treat report, and the name of the report actually comes from one of our respondents, probably more than one of our respondents if I remember right, who talked about being told that they were too complicated to treat and therefore being denied access to mental health services. So the aim of the report was to, and the research around it, was to establish what was happening when it came to autistic people in Scotland trying to access mental health services. And what we found was that a large number of autistic people were being denied access to services. So I'm just going to bring up some of the statistics from that report. 42% said that they were not understood, listened to, or taken seriously by practitioners. This is mental health practitioners. 26% said that they were denied mental health services as a direct result of being autistic. 30% had problems with inaccessible services, so that's things like being asked to use the phone or needing to go to a busy area that they couldn't get to. 36% said practitioners had inadequate knowledge of autism. 40% believe that there is nothing out there to help them. And 52% said that they had negative experiences of mental health services. So that's, they are still really painful responses to read 5 years on. And what we did at the time was we did bring this to the CPG and also to, I think, the Minister for Mental Health at the time, with a focus particularly on that initial point of autistic people being denied mental health services directly as a result of being autistic, and also autistic people not being able to access those services due to them being not accessible to us. I think some of the big takeaways was that there needed to be a really serious overhaul of how mental health services for autistic people are structured. There needed to be better autism understanding within the NHS, and there needed to be more autistic-led training to try and sort of spur that understanding.
So, partly as a result of what you learned researching that report, you went on to train to become a counsellor.
Yeah.
And you produced another piece of research closely related on autistic people's experiences of counselling, with more of a focus on what does work.
Yeah, so I don't really like to sort of, ask a question about what's wrong without being able to then ask a question about, how do we fix it? So, as part of my almost as part of my counselling training journey, it was sort of partly towards the beginning of that, I was also looking into what was going wrong at the stage of autistic people being able to access support, and also what was going right. And this felt like a sort of important next step, because for those respondents from the Too Complicated to Treat report who were getting through to mental health services, I think I'd sort of mentioned that statistic there of people feeling not understood or not heard. That's something that resonated again in our talk therapies report, both on the side of people not feeling heard, and that was very negative, but also what came out really strongly was that those autistic people who had contact with practitioners who really validated their experiences, really heard what was going on, believed that we were struggling, those are the people who had the most positive experiences, and I think the most helpful experiences of talk therapies.
So 5 years on from your original report, what do you think the situation is like with respect to autistic people accessing mental health support?
it's not improved is probably the blunt way to put it. Of course, I'm aware there's been a pandemic. In that time, there's been massive pressures on mental health services for all kinds of communities. And of course, that's come out as being being particularly difficult for a lot of autistic people. I think we're seeing the results of a lot more isolation, the results of a lot more people who have had lengthened waiting lists, who are struggling to access services that are taking on different forms or having to change. So it's not a good situation at the moment.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that came out of the pandemic was a lot more remote working. And it's probably fair to say that for some autistic people, being able to access mental health support remotely has been helpful, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, actually. Thanks, Fergus. One thing that was a positive that we did see during the pandemic was some autistic people who have never been able to access mental health services before, being able to access them for the first time. And, to the credit of many mental health services, many have stayed online. I am concerned about the move back to in-person only, because I think autistic people and a lot of other disabled people have really valued suddenly finding services a bit more accessible. Now, at the same time, there are a significant number of autistic people who don't get on with online. Mm-hmm. So I think what this is telling me is there needs to be, and this is what we were saying 5 years ago as well, is there needs to be more flexibility. Yeah. We now know that online works. We need to keep that, but also have the option of working face-to-face, potentially outdoors, all of the other options that are out there.
Yeah, so more diversity of provision and more flexibility.
Absolutely, yeah.
What else do you think needs to change?
I think something that we've seen as a result of the pandemic, is a real loss of a lot of more flexible local community support services, mental health services. And, what this has shown me is there is a real kind of, that they've been really filling the gap for a lot of autistic people. One of the reasons they're filling the gap is they tend to be more flexible, although not always. It's very patchy. It can obviously be a bit of a postcode lottery, what's available. Also, they tend to be either low cost or free. If it's say a local health service run, charity run mental health service, for example. We're looking at a community within the autistic community where far more autistic people are likely to be unemployed, to have financial pressures, greater financial pressures, and also have significant mental health difficulties that may be framed by mental health services as complex. I always feel like, the ideal situation would be for there to be a national and extremely flexible mental health service that is really catered to autistic needs, to neurodivergent needs, which means that it needs to be really responsive, it needs to be long-term.
Yeah, this is not just about autistic needs, right? But just recognising and anticipating neurodiversity from the beginning.
Yeah, and, anticipating that there are a lot of ways that people can be different. And I think, we are seeing a lot of people who are newly realising that they're autistic for the first time and finding this massive gap in service provision just as they're trying to figure out, what happens throughout their lives, what it all means. I think, it's really important that just as we're needing more flexibility at this really critical post-pandemic time, and as the cost of living crisis and everything else, this is actually a time where we need more flexibility for the most vulnerable members of our society. And what we're seeing instead is a move to go towards greater rigidity. So, for instance, we're seeing mental health nurses in a lot of NHS trusts being moved more towards, say, 6 sessions of CBT as a sort of as the only option rather than, say, a more flexible check-in. We're seeing sort of reduced services when it comes to talk therapies. We need something, at the very least, for the most vulnerable people that's more flexible, ideally for everyone.
Well, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks, Fergus.